Well, we could do introductions. We did that once, because I don't know if everybody knows each other.
Yeah, small.
Yeah.
Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. My name is Becky Iverson. I'm one of the bloggers. My blog is Compendium, and I'm so glad that you are all here because I'm really excited for this.
Is that what you like? You're old Becky,
Yes. He's my close.
My name is James, and I'm an actor.
My name is Jennifer Bielstein, and I'm with the Guthrie Theater.
My turn. Connie Shaver. I'm the PR director here at Park Square. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
I'm Mackenzie Pitterly. I'm the annual fund manager here at Park Square.
I'm Andrea Gross. I freelance as a costume designer, and I'm the company manager for Nimbus.
I'm Shelli Smith, and I'm the founder and artistic director for Chain Reaction Theater Project.
I'm Laura Adams, and I'm the wigmaster at the Guthrie, and do a lot of EDI work. And I'm also a rape crisis advocate at Mercy Unity Hospital.
I'm Pogi Sumangil. I'm an actor in town here. Also, I work on the staff at the Minnesota Theater Alliance. We'll talk about history stuff, I think, in it, but have some other work to do around sexual assault prevention.
I'm Caroline Palmer. I'm the public and legal affairs manager at the Minnesota Collition Against Sexual Assault. I brought some materials here if at any point you want to grab any of that. And I am going to be facilitating the conversation. Thank you for having me.
I'm your guest moderator.
And in my other life, I also am a writer about dance and performance and do occasionally blog, but I am not doing anything on the record tonight. Don't worry about any of that. I'm here strictly in my MNCASA capacity.
My name is Laura Cullen. I'm also one of the bloggers I write for Twin Cities Stages.
I'm Jill Schaefer. I'm a blogger at Cherry Spoon. I'm Shirley Coleman. I'm a freelance director.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. And we've got a great panel here. We'll get the conversation started. But, if there's anything you want to ask along the way, please do. We'll probably be turning this more into a conversation as we get going. But I'm going to ask each of our panelists to talk a little bit about yourself and your career in the Twin Cities arts community or beyond Twin Cities as well. So would you like to start, Becky?
Sure. Well, I grew up here both as a human and as an actor. I don't know how else to put that. I was I started my career here as well. Let's see. Just career stuff. Started as an actor, became a playwright in 2009, and got a fellowship at the Playwright Center and had my first play produced. I self-produced at Fringe in 2011, and I had a first full production of a full-length show over on the street at History Theater in 2015. So other things.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So, short version is I, too, as a human being, grew up here. So I am from Minnesota. I was a child actor at Children's Theater back in the 80s. Fell into wig making while a student there. So I am a performer as well as a theater technician. So it's kind of an interesting thing because I float between those two worlds, and there's a lot of parallels around it, but there's a lot of differences as well. And I started really investigating this conversation in a broader sense a couple of years ago when I brought forth a case against the man who abused me as a child and the institution that harbored those people who were abusing children. And so since then, I've had a lot of conversations, and I've had a lot of people approach me around the issues of sexual assault, sexual harassment, particularly with children, but also with women. And I just wanted to say that as we're having this conversation, that I think primarily we're talking about women being victims in the arena of assault and harassment, but that men are certainly victims of that as well. That I think it's important for us to acknowledge that. that I think mostly we're talking about women tonight, but just like in the back of our minds, we've got to remember this is not just a one-sided issue, that it's all of us. And so as a result of the stuff that happened to me as a child, I've really felt like my experience could be used as a tool to help other people. So that's why I decided to speak out and why I do the advocacy work that I do. So I'm always happy to have the conversations. So thanks for inviting me.
My first degree was in business, and I was a banker. And then I discovered my love of theater late, and knew I was too old to learn from experience. So I went back to the University of Minnesota and got a theater degree, knowing that I wanted to start my own social justice theater company because I had seen the power of theater. I was in a musical. That's how I discovered it. But, yeah, I love to sing and dance. And I learned as much as I could about theater. And then one day, Candace Barrett says, "What are you waiting for, Shelli?" And away I went. Yeah. So we delved into some pretty tough subjects. We are a 501c3 organization, very small. It's basically me and 4 working board members, a lead volunteer, and everybody else is hired on contract on a project basis. So I'm not like the Guthrie where I have all these peeps. So yeah, and we were founded in 2012, and we have dealt. Every single production we've done has had something to do with sexual abuse or sexual violence somewhere in it. We did one, a production called 7, which is about women around the world, and they're all true stories, are based on true stories, everything we do, and performed in intimate venues because it just helps 10,000 things, so you know how that works. It impacts the audiences, see each other's reactions, and you're all right there together. You can't get away. It's really powerful. So yeah, we did one about women around the world fighting different injustices, and it included things like gang rape, domestic abuse, sex trafficking, Cambodia, and then we went out to, I got to look at my notes so I remember everything. We've dealt with genocide, which of course that gets into all kinds of things as well, even to clean global water, which again that mostly affects women and girls, and they are often at risk for being raped or abused and violated. I wrote a play on, some of the plays I write, some of them I don't, depends on if somebody's already done what I want to say. We did one on Invisible about homeless suburban youth, and those youth are at really high risk for sex trafficking. I also volunteer at a drop-in center for homeless youth in Bloomington, Oasis. And last year we did one on called Body and Soul about juvenile sex trafficking. And now we're working on a project surrounding or exploring masculinity. And what I think we're unique in that we perform in multiple venues. We always match the venues to the issues in the play, and our whole purpose is to raise awareness of the issues and inspire people to take action. So we bring in different nonprofits whose missions match the issues in the play, and they're there to provide information, participate in the talkback, and tell people how they can get involved. We have a mix of people in the audience. Sometimes they're survivors, or they can relate to the issues in the play personally. Quite often, we're not preaching to the choir. They have no clue. They have no clue what they're walking into. Because we always perform, we find free space most of the time, and it's at places that will help us build the audience and help us promote. So that's in a nutshell. Well, that was big. Sorry, but that's what we did.
I moved to the Twin Cities in 2005 when I finished an MFA in costume design. I grew up in Northern California and went to grad school at Urbana-Champaign in Illinois. So that's the path to how I got here. And so in those 12 years, I've been a freelance designer most of the time. I had a 4-year stint on the faculty at Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter from 2006 to 2010. And my Twin Cities debut in 2005 was with the company Nimbus, that I'm now a company member and the company manager for. Nimbus grew out of a series of fringe shows in the early 2000s. Almost all the work we do now is devised work in the rehearsal period, which I think brings some interesting things to this conversation in the sense of we're not working with a script you can know ahead of time and make a choice about. We choose a topic of interest. It might be an event or it might just be a topic. We've done a bunch of different things. And we've sort of refined the process down at this point that for the most part, we're doing like a table work research brainstorming section of things, what we call an open eye. The logo for Nimbus is an eye, which is like a staged reading at various points. Some of them have been more complete than others. We take a big break, and one of the two artistic directors finishes the script. Finished is loosely finished. Josh isn't here yet, so I can say loosely finished. And we come back into a 5-week rehearsal period where things do continue to evolve and edit in that process as well. We have an undefined core set of regulars, and we try really hard to bring in new actors as well. And so one of the reasons that we've, and I believe I was invited here tonight because we're developing a policy for how to handle this. And so we're putting things on paper and trying to figure out how we want to be responsible to this issue. One of the reasons that that's a thing for us is that we'll have a room of 6 or 8 actors, and 4 of them have been doing this together. 8 of them, maybe except for 1, have been doing this together in this context with these people for so long. And how does that new person or those new people feel safe, feel welcomed? I mean, we do work really hard from the social standpoint of it to not be building a clique and a vernacular that have to be explained all the time. But that for us that is one thing we are working on. And then as this theme and topic has arisen over and over, we've realized that not having a clear path defined for how those communities are built is a problem. And so as a freelance designer, I work for companies the size of Nimbus. I work here. I worked at the Ordway, at the Jungle. I have a big project in Northfield right now with Stephen Koplowitz, which involves both colleges and the community. And then I'm going to take a break and finish growing a human. But so that's, yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. I think you kind of touched a little bit on what brings you here tonight. So what I want to open it into is talking about what do we think is maybe unique about the setting of the arts in the theater when we're talking about sexual harassment. And what is it really about the venues that you're working in that are different than maybe other settings? And I'll probably jump around a little bit in the panel. Andrea, do you want to go first with this one?
Sure. Well, I think a few weeks ago at the Minnesota Theater Alliance panel that you guys were a part of, I think it was Laura who did a really good job articulating the idea that a lot of us end up in theater as young people because we feel like we don't fit anywhere else. And because we feel welcomed and we feel safe. And so I think that base level of community is sort of the like emotional reason we're all here. Like we have political reasons for making art or, rational, logical things about it. Not so much maybe, but there's a really core emotional need that's met by having a community like this. It's a place where people get really vulnerable with each other. As an aside, it seems like mostly we have actors and directors in the room, but as a designer, like, hi, we just met. Please take off your clothes and put this on instead. I have really strange conversations with people who I've known for 4.5 minutes. And that sort of like immediate intimacy can take a long time to get used to. Then it can be a thing we kind of pride ourselves on, and we really enjoy being a part of that environment and having that, again, that safety and that vulnerability. But I think that what we're learning too late, quite frankly, is that comes with an enormous responsibility that we haven't been articulate about. Even if we've been thinking about it, we haven't been articulate about it. So that, to me, that's the unique challenge of doing what we do. And I think in this community, because there are both so many and so few of us, we end up working with the same people over and over again. Like that's a particular piece of the culture at Nimbus, but it's not unique to Nimbus. And we start to rely on old information or old assumptions and just not always thinking through each set of relationships as a new thing to navigate and a new set of standards and parameters and boundaries is complicated.
Absolutely. Shelli, do you want to join in, and then we'll go down the road?
Yeah, as far as why use theater, is that the question?
Yeah, really, what kind of makes this venue different than other work settings?
It's really interesting. Because on our masculinity project, I've been working with different men, actually, because I want to hear what they have to say so we can learn from each other, and men that have been working with boys and men. And one of them looked at me the other day and said, you have a lot of power. I'm like, yeah, it is kind of scary, actually, because between theater and then we also use our social media outlets, too, in which we keep expanding to create awareness of an issue. So it is a big responsibility as well, is how you handle that, too. But you can reach so many people if you do it right. And it's just, like I said, our whole purpose is to raise awareness of issues that we feel need to get out there. And, it's a way we can reach a lot of people at once. So, and you can take it beyond just the performance, too. Like I said, with social media, you can get the audience involved in helping to write it. You can do little mini readings. There's a myriad of ways to do that. So, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think it does in the sense that it's a public place,
right?
And at the same time, I think you're kind of balancing intimacy that then is manifested in a public place. Mm-hmm. So I think it's sort of an interesting place that people straddle, I think, from time to time in these two worlds.
Right, and especially, like I said, there's people in the audience who actually see themselves on the stage. Mm-hmm. In fact, we have to be careful with the work we have because we never know whose triggers we're going to set.
Mm-hmm. Right, absolutely.
Because you never know who has what triggers and what's going to set them off. So
yeah. Well, and I think even maybe within the cast.
Yeah, I was going to say, even with working with my actors, especially on the last one, Body and Soul, about sex trafficking, and they were all new to this. So, I mean, the very first read-through, one of the first things I said to them is, it's going to be some tough stuff, and if anybody ever feels like they need to leave the room, no questions asked, do it. I mean, we all need to take care of ourselves and explain about vicarious trauma. And yeah, you get into a lot of really close, vulnerable conversations too, even as the artists, the men and the women. The men are learning what it's like to be a woman. The women are learning what it's like to be a man. And those conversations, I think, are really important to understand each other. A lot of surprises that you don't know about because you're not inhabiting somebody else's body and life.
Right, exactly. You want to put on to that?
Yeah, well, I wanted Andrea used the word boundaries, and that just sparked some things for me around what I just feel like so much of the core of the problem around sexism and sexual harassment, it's boundary issues. And that for women, we at a very young age learn how to move boundaries, or we are sometimes even our boundaries being moved are imposed upon us by Uncle Jack, who's creepy, and Mom makes you kiss him anyway. And then so we don't really have ownership over our bodies from a very young age. And that we learn how to just keep adjusting, and that safe space that we set for ourselves gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And then all of a sudden you find yourself in a bar and this guy's sitting next to you and you're accepting it because at least he's not touching me, or if he's touching you, at least he's not trying to kiss me, or it's just like we keep moving those boundaries. So when we do that in life, we do that in work. And I think with actors in particular, I think it's less of an issue in the tech world, but in the world where actors are communicating and dealing with each other on such intimate levels. I mean, we're in dressing rooms stripping down in front of each other. If you're in a small theater, sometimes there's one dressing room and you are stripping down to nothing and next to somebody you just met 2 weeks ago. And that sometimes forces intimacy in a way that isn't always comfortable for everybody, but we accept it because it's sort of part of the norm, so we just do it that way. And there are some interesting things around, just in my world, with in the wig world. It's interesting to deal with actors in relation to their hair because people are very attached to this frame that is around their face, and that I have to be psychological sometimes around the way that I work with actors, because that there are a lot of personal issues going on, that people are very sensitive about things. So, and you probably find this true for yourself as well, Andrea, that when we're dealing with the way somebody looks, there you can stumble into some things that are, you got to be very careful. And you also just talked about triggers, Shelli, and that's a new word. I mean, my husband has known about my abuse for a long time, but I said the word triggers a few months ago, and he went, "Triggers, what's that?" Like, he didn't, it's new territory that we're in. Who heard of the term rape culture more than 2 years ago? I mean, we just didn't, that wasn't something that was part of our vernacular. So we are all in a learning process, all over the board, and that it's no less complicated in theater situations. And I know, Pogi, you've talked in the past, I've heard you talk about, hope that you will do now, about how we do create some safe spaces for people to be able to navigate that. When you walk in, you have a set of experiences that you walk into the door with, and that's going to be very different if you're walking into a medical office where you're just answering phones than you are when you're walking into a rehearsal hall. So it's very different. So I'll shut up now.
I think, to yes and everything that's been said, I think the Alliance hosted just when I first came onto the Alliance, they were working on a series of like half-day kind of sessions, workshops called the PARTS sessions, which stands for Performing Arts Human Resources Toolkit Series. And now there's a website that has all that information. It's the acronym is always weird, PAHRTS. And I have to see it. As opposed to putting the H in the wrong place, because that spells things, and then people, it's weird. Yeah, and so within that, what we did is we worked with a legal firm and talked about hiring practices and that kind of thing. And what was so interesting is almost every time, and this was once a month for 6 or 7 months, maybe 8 months, we would have a session, and almost every time there was a loophole because you're in theater. Like, you can, in our industry, discriminate against people because of their race and the way that they look and their height and their body type in some cases. Like, you can do that, and that's totally, there's a loophole in the law to allow theaters to be able to do that in our business. And so to say why theater is different, that's a huge glaring thing. And I think that there are a lot of stereotypes in the business of especially when it comes to dressing in under. I find that, like, as I've kind of evaluated myself over like the years, I've been like, oh, I've totally been that guy that someone will say, oh, I'll step out of the room, and I will say, no, it's fine, I'm an actor. And then start taking clothes off, and then you go, well, wait, that's only because I'm comfortable. Like, that other person might be totally uncomfortable with the fact that I'm about to strip down, but I just assume that, like, because I'm the one doing the undressing, that they should somehow be fine with it. I don't know why that is a stereotype of actors. Also, like, we're huggers and we give each other back rubs and we're just like physically like whatever. And as I've done some fight choreography and I've done some working with youth, I always try to say, make sure that your partner, whoever you're working with, and whatever kind of scenario that we're talking about, make sure you have a very explicit conversation about where you do not like to be touched. Like I think that's super important for people to recognize that they don't have a vocabulary for that. I think that itself is a very important thing to say. I don't know how to say this, and sometimes I'll give examples and say, like, anywhere where a bathing suit would cover, I don't like to be touched there, or like really specific places, like
people don't like to be touched on the shoulder. Some people, I dated a woman who didn't like her knees. She was actually disgusted by her own knees. And I was like, oh, that's odd. But then you think, as a person who wants to show affection for another person, you're driving in the car and sometimes your hand just kind of goes over and you're like, I have to remember that. I have to download that information. And that kind of stuff is like, oh, I'm a physically open person because that was part of the training of being an actor, and you shouldn't really be making that kind of assumption with the people that you're working with, because there are ways to approach that kind of thing in the context of a rehearsal where, one of the things that I have done in the past is to teach consent. And now, having been teaching that, it's interesting to have the examples of my parents saying, like, oh, you got to hug and kiss your auntie, and you'll have to make sure you say hi to everybody, and what does that mean? And now with my goddaughter, I'm watching her go through it, and she's 4, and sometimes what I'm trying to impart on her is that can mean a lot of different things. Just acknowledging somebody coming in the room. You don't always have to hug me, you don't always have to kiss me, but maybe if you just wave, that's totally cool, but that acknowledgement is a good thing to know that your body is your body, and you don't have to do anything that you don't want to do, and that sometimes there's another way of accomplishing the same task, which I think is super important to put it into practice in your life, and to practice consent in a lot of different ways, because we naturally do that. We actually do a lot of consent work in our day-to-day life. We just don't call it that and put a little big heavy weight on it or anything. But we often ask, is it okay if I do this? Is it okay if I take this chair and move it over here? Is it okay if I do and so when people kind of get up in arms about oh, consent is so awkward, I never I hear that all the time, and I feel like that's such we do it all the time. We just put a layer of awkwardness on it. So I think that in the world of kind of theater and creating, there's a lot of assumptions that people make about who we are and what we do. And I think part of breaking through that is putting it into practice and modeling good behavior.
So that assumptions piece is really interesting, and anybody can just kind of jump in at this point. Sort of the assumptions within your community, but then to your audiences or to the donors or whoever else is part of the world too. Do you find that there's these conceptions that are placed on actors? You sort of use the term open, more physically open, and more available, that people sort of assume you're there in a different way, that maybe they would treat somebody a little bit differently. Is that something that kind of comes along with it?
I think that's true for actors. I mean, I think it's funny when you're in a position where you're in the public eye, people tend to feel like they have some kind of ownership over you because you're public.
Right.
So they just assume that it's okay to come in. And I was thinking about this the other day, because we have the amazing Paula Vogel, playwright at the Guthrie this last month, off and on. And she's this amazing playwright, and the play that she put on stage right now is just extraordinary. And there's so much of her in there, and it's such a beautiful piece of work. And when you read something like that, and you read the articles that she talks about, and it's like you feel like you know her, and yet you don't know her. You don't know her at all. And so you walk up to her, and it's like, I want to just give her a hug and go, Paula! She doesn't even know my name. So there's something about that we just feel like we connect to people in the public eye, and that sort of takes a barrier down that doesn't necessarily deserve to be taken down. Like, we need to honor people's space, and we don't tend to do that.
Right.
And I don't think we're taught how to do that, really. Like, you were just talking about people thinking consent, like, what's that? And we don't grow up learning about consent in general. I mean, some people grew up in households where they weren't, like, you get the choice about whether or not you go over and say hi to Uncle Johnny or whatever. But even in schools, we aren't taught how to even be in relationship with each other in a classroom. We just, it's just not part of how we learn. So where do we learn that? I mean, where do we? I mean, I don't know where we do. Where do we? You know, I would love that. I would love that it sort of becomes part of the conversation. And I feel like if we're not doing it in school and it's not happening consistently in the home, the next place is the workplace, and that those conversations need to be had. You know, I spend more time with the people at work than I do with my family. So those relationships. That's a practice ground for me to learn how to do all of this stuff right. And if I don't have anybody at my workplace that knows how to do that in a safe and healthy way, I'm floating. So teaching people how to teach this stuff is really important.
Yeah, and eventually I think you sometimes kind of find you don't have a safe place anymore.
Exactly.
Which can be very isolating feeling. Yeah. Shelli or Andrea, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Not so much to that. I just think audiences don't have a clue how much work actors do to do what they do. And then if they're playing a real person, they always ask me, is that really? No, that's an actor. But to add to what you were saying, in our last one again with Body and Soul, that was really a tough one for the actors to embody these real people. And they're like, ooh, I'm just so glad that I didn't actually live that, although I think one of my actors was a survivor. So, it was really cool in rehearsal because they already had these boundaries between them, because there was a scene that they were in a strip club, the two college-age girls who were forced to do this, and the others were playing the rowdy customers in the bar and pushing them upstairs. Where they were going to be raped by each man one by one. And, of course, they're like, shake it off. But in playing that, they had to get close. So it was actually mostly, it was both the men and the women were like, okay, where are you comfortable being touched? Where can I, because I feel like I should slap you on the butt. Is that okay? Or, what's okay with you? And they were I didn't even direct that. They just naturally had those conversations on their own. What's okay with you? What can I do? What's not? And I thought that was really cool.
Well, then kind of shifting this, because I think that's a great segue into sort of how do these conversations happen and how do you create policies and approaches and things like that. So what do you think are some sort of proactive frameworks that should be kept in mind when creating a sexual harassment policy? And these can be frameworks that encompass how actors work together in rehearsal and performance, but also just how a theater is administered, all the different aspects of the work. What do you think are some good ways to start putting together policies? Maybe, Andrea, you want to start on this one since you've been kind of having the conversation.
Sure. Like I was saying in my introduction to the work that Nimbus does, this grew out of an interest in building a new community each time we build a piece and what that involves and how to sort of equalize that conversation. So we were having conversations in a very general way about this for quite a while. I think the scandal in Chicago that led to Not in Our House really motivated us, and I know one of the prompt questions was, what's a good resource for that? I will say the Not in Our House website is a tremendous resource. They have
everybody
templates.
Familiar with Not in Our House?
So this is a group of Chicago performance artists who came together after several instances of high-profile sexual harassment. I think the sort of tipping point last one was an artistic director where once one person told the story, everyone in the community was like, oh, that's just how it is to work there. That's just, everybody just knows that. I don't know. Everybody. It was like that communal moment of yeah, that doesn't seem like a way we should be living. Really? That's just the way it is there? And so they've come together and had a series of really in-depth conversations from a lot of different angles, and they've put this set of templates out onto the internet that you can very easily download and adapt. And they've thought about I highly recommend it. They've thought about some really cool stuff and really put some in-depth angles on things. So it started with hashtag Not in Our House, and I'm almost positive it's notinourhouse.org. Yeah, Josh, do you remember the website?
It's either that or the Chicago Theater Standards, something like that.
They call them they call them the Chicago Theater Standards, these templates that they've developed. So we've relied heavily on that. And I think some of the frames that we are coming at this with is a strong urge toward anonymity again, circling back to this idea that we work with each other everywhere. And some story you heard in a bar one time about some person that doesn't fully leave your mind, like those really, it just spirals through all these relationships for decades. And so we've put a strong premium on that. We've put a strong premium on accountability, on wanting to be able to document everything that happens so that everybody has something they can sign off on and say, I'm not satisfied with the outcome, but yes, this is what happened, or this is what happened and I am satisfied with the outcome. There was a third thing I wanted to say. I think also flexibility, because most of us have never done this before. So we're going to draft these documents, we're going to come up with this policy. I can outline that a little bit more specifically if it's relevant later. And then we're going to try it a couple times, and then we have to be able to go back and say, I mean, hopefully without an actual practical instance of it being employed, we have to go back and be like, okay, that's weird. I didn't see how that was going to play out in the rehearsal hall. I didn't understand how that language, that didn't occur to me. That level of evolutionary flexibility for the policy, I think, is a really important thing to keep in mind. And how are you going to arrive at that? So we're talking about, if we can figure out the anonymity piece of it, we're talking about figuring out a way to make it a piece of an annual company meeting, where without betraying anyone, we can say, this is a thing that happened, this is how it was handled, and let the other members of the company be able to be like, really? We did that in our name? That's a thing that happened? Or, wow, I'm extremely proud. It wouldn't have occurred to me to have that conversation that way. But keeping a review process piece sort of orbiting around the whole thing, I think is important to us as well.
Absolutely. Anything else anybody would like to add about a policy or some steps you could take?
I mean, I as a group that is naturally role-playing oriented, I feel like once there is a policy in place, walk through it. I think because a lot of times I hear people say, oh, we want to get into the practice of reading our policy, and then you hit in the way that it hits my ears, like the dreaded open door policy. It's like, oh, you can come talk to anybody. We totally open. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? What happens at that point? Because the work that I was doing was with Catharsis Productions, based out of Chicago, and I was doing sexual assault prevention for the military. And they're obviously there's protocol for everything in the military. And so they had, in the 90s, they had instituted what they called restricted and unrestricted reporting. So previously, it was you report to the leadership in your unit if something had happened, and it goes up the chain of command, and it has to either be prosecuted or they have to do an investigation. And so the problem that created was, if I'm going to report this and hell is going to rain down on me from the other people in my unit, why would I ever report it? And so what they found by instituting, because everyone knows about it at that point, so what they found out about doing restricted and unrestricted reporting was restricted reporting is anonymous. There are 4 resources that you can go to. They make it very clear, because I had to give those trainings, who your 4 resources are, and literally anyone else could trigger an unrestricted report, which means investigation all the way up to potential court-martial, right? So what they found is when they instituted restricted reporting, that both restricted and unrestricted reporting went up. That people were actually feeling safe to come out of the shadows and say this stuff is happening, and these are the people. The problem with restricted reporting is that you will still be working with the person potentially in your workspace who had perpetrated this upon you. And that's all the choice of the survivor. So part of it is also keeping a mindset toward what is this person potentially going through in order to make that report initially. That itself is a hard thing to do. So how do you make that, how do you maintain an environment where that conversation can happen safely, and where resources are talked about and where people kind of know the next steps, so that they're not falling into a situation where suddenly they're in the newspaper, or suddenly there's some other thing that happens that was unintended. So as clear as you can make it, I think that's as far as like the steps in the process, I think that's probably my urge toward a best practice is to try to keep it something that is super duper clear, because I actually don't see that in a lot of times when I've heard people talk about their harassment policies. It just seems to be like, come talk to us about it, and that's where they stop. Like, there's so much more that happens after come talk to us about it. Because I think that the other thing that makes being a freelancer or a contractor weird is, what if I never get hired back at this theater again, and who's to say it's because I'm not the right kind of person to play a part, and or that feeling, that nagging kind of fear that like maybe I'm being difficult, or maybe that time that I reported they just didn't like the fact that I potentially made their theater look bad or made the director look bad. And so those are all the things that people are up against when the power dynamic is, management and employee relationship.
And I think the fear and retaliation and the power dynamic is so prevalent. And I mean, certainly all venues have bosses and things like that. But I mean, I'm going to maybe go out on a limb and say, directors have a special sort of control. And when you have policies, but yet you still have somebody who's in a position of power who can make or break your career sometimes, as we've seen in these bigger cases in Hollywood and things like that, but certainly in theater it happens too. What can we do to help people feel safe? Because you're right, when you come forward and you have absolutely no idea what's going to happen once you go through that open door. It could be fine, it could be the end of everything, and how do you help people find that comfort level and have supports, and how do you make sure whatever policy you set up doesn't gotcha to people as they try to come forward?
I want to say about policy in particular that you can have all the most beautiful words in the world and a policy that's in gold on a placard, and it doesn't make any difference if you're not implementing it and you're not following through on it. Words mean nothing. It's people taking actions that really make a difference. And I know just at the Guthrie there are beautiful policies that have been put into place, and people with the best of intentions in positions of power, and we still had a thing happen recently. And so it's not really, it's more about the systemic problem than it is about, let's say a bunch of things that sound good. It's really about, let's look at what's really happening here and address the systemic problem within our culture, not just within that building. And it's so much deeper than any of us really recognize. And it takes, I was talking to somebody recently about how long it takes for there to truly implement lasting change in an organization that has had an administration switch over, and it takes 6 to 10 years for things to completely evolve.
Right.
That's a long time.
Right.
So if you have a piece of paper at the back of a contract that says, I read the policy, you can scratch your little name on there. You don't even have to read the piece of paper. Right. All you got to do is sign it and hand it in. Doesn't mean that you really are knowing what's going on. So it's really about making sure that everybody's on the same page, that when there are things that happen, that there is follow-through and there's transparency so everybody sees what's going on. Because if you send information off into the ether and you never get any information back, you don't feel heard. And that doesn't mean that you're not heard, but you need to know. I mean, people need to know that. So that's, I think, within the policy, that's an important piece, that there has to be a cyclical or a circular conversation. It can't just be a one-sided thing. And I completely didn't answer the question that you just posed, but it was just part of policy.
Though, because, I mean, you're saying essentially that you could have something written down, you could have a policy set up there, but it still might not answer those crucial questions somebody who's been harmed has when they take a look at that policy and go, okay, now I'm going to consider reporting. I have no idea what's going to happen when I go through this door. And I think that's huge, and that's not just a problem for theater, it's a problem in all workplaces when we set up these policies. But I think you're right, it really does come down to this culture shift and what we have embedded in our culture. And Shelli, it might be an interesting piece for you to look at based on the work that you're doing. You look at some very intense social justice issues. How do you kind of see that representation in the art you're doing, and then how you're running the art that you're doing?
Yeah, this is what was running through my mind, because as I said, we're so small. Yeah. But there's a whole lot of small theater companies in Minnesota. There's more small ones than big ones, I think. So I think about this as like policies. I'm going, because we've got, as I said, we get into such conversations, both with my cast and my designers, because this stuff is tough. So we're talking tough stuff all the time. And I mean, about people who are getting harassed and abused. So, I mean, there's that right there, that they're all so open. And it's even with my board of directors, because it's a working board, and we've got myself and other 2 males and 2 females. And so even in board meetings, we're getting into these tough conversations. So I'm thinking, well, who the heck would ever then even go harass somebody within our little teeny organization? But I can't be naive and go, but it's always in the back of my mind. But I do think it helps prevent it somewhat, but I'm not naive enough to think it would never happen either. But I mean, again, it's like, well, a policy, yes, it's important, but it's like, yeah, it's sort of like a Band-Aid at the really, really, really deep wound. It's only trying to keep it from oozing out, but, you've got to get to the root of it. And I think about this a lot because and I've been talking, as I said, to a lot of men because I want to know what they think too. But if you think of the women's movement, it's like, I can remember when I was in college the first time, and we were like, I was in business school, and we called our sorority a fraternity, and we put on our little navy blue suits and our scarves that were like men's ties and our pumps, and we went to our interviews. We looked like little men. It was ridiculous. But that's what we did. We were going to break through that glass ceiling. Well, here we are, still working on it. But it's getting better, and that whole Me Too thing. And I had a conversation with my husband. He's like, what is this? I said, you don't understand, because they are getting power in numbers. Because before that, if you would speak up, quite often nobody would believe you, nothing would happen, and suddenly people know, and even though you're the victim, now you're the one that's being stigmatized, and now you're even, being blamed for this and that, and a victim 2-3 times over. But in numbers, people are going, oh, well, maybe this is true. So I think women are starting to, they're getting more assertive and starting to develop a language and even maybe a power together. I mean, I'm looking at all these gymnasts even joining together, like who knew, or all these athletes. But I think, and guys, I want to hear from you. Trust me. It's like, I think all the messages that boys get from a very, very young age, and girls too, about how we're supposed to behave. The girls are supposed to be, don't speak up, and guys, you've got to be in control, and you're in charge, and all these messages. And I mean, think of all the stuff that are even in ads and movies, like that movie Sandlot. And, you can go on and on and on about the messages that are teaching us how to behave as we're growing up. I wrote a play about those choices, but that hit everything. And it makes us be who we really aren't. So think about when you watch women who are friends, how they converse, compared to like if I'm in the gym and there's a couple guys on me behind me on the treadmill, their conversation is so different than to women. It's like, it's just shorter and choppier, it's just different. And somebody at Cornerstone Advocacy, one of the male counselors was telling me the other day, so he gave me an example like, okay, so you've got a group of boys on the playground, and one of them, he falls down, hard. He's really in pain. He's hurting. But what's worse is he's absolutely terrified because there's a tear starting to roll down his cheek. He's scared to death. And he said the coolest thing would be if he could just let those tears go, and all the other guys would come and comfort him, and then they'd all feel like they can just let the tears go too, and the same thing happens to them, and they'd all feel so much better. And I said, yeah, but what if that guy's like the kingpin on the playground, and all of a sudden he goes, yeah, that's the risk he takes. So I went home and I asked my husband, I goes, that's true. You know, and another man said to me the other day, you know, most boys, they're scared and they're lonely. So I think that now it's time for men to start developing their conversation around it too, which is tough because I've had Ian Black, the comedian. Has anybody seen his threads? Go look him up. He's really talking good stuff right now, and he's getting trashed for it by guys. Not all, but some. So go on Twitter and look. It's really cool. So now I went on one of my tangents. I think, you know, and I have a lot of guys talking to me too about romance in the workplace and how many people have actually met their life partner at work. And, you know, and they're like scared. We don't even know how to navigate this anymore. I'm afraid I'm going to get, you know, lose my job or whatever because who knows what, you know. So somehow there's got to be a conversation, you know, that's tough, that develop between people, and how that happens, that's something we all have to figure out. But, you know, otherwise we're going to keep writing policies, and you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
And then you have to look at, you know, I mean, I can't help but think about Garrison Keillor right now. So he's claiming that this was a mutual romance, but then at some point she said that's enough, and he claims he pulled back. But he is a powerful radio personality, director, stalwart of NPR for decades. Mm-hmm. And can you have any equality in that type of situation?
Yeah, I've been going around asking guys questions too. How do guys like Weinstein and those guys, how did they get like that? I mean, they weren't born that way. They're born cute little innocent babies, you know? So what happens? Well, I think, you know, nobody has an exact answer, even those who work with incarcerated youth and men and everything else. They don't know. But I'm trying to put it together, but I think it's the messages they get, how they're supposed to behave as a man, according to whoever raised them, and what messages were coming at them. And again, my poor husband, I went to him again and said, why are they acting like that? Because, well, after all these years, you know, they're going up the ladder because people keep telling them how good they are and they're up their power, and they've got these huge egos and they've had these messages come at them. They think they can just do anything.
And nobody holds them accountable if they do something wrong.
No, but that's it's like you got to start from birth, you know? Or have some people intervene along the way and say, hey, knock it off. But
which is a really hard thing to do because you're breaking out of the social norm.
Exactly.
If you're the kid who is comforting the crying kid.
Yep.
Which is like, you don't want to be that kid either on the play. You know what I mean?
Right. It's either pray or be preyed upon.
Yeah. Well, and Dan Savage makes an interesting point about this. If you look at old pictures of men, particularly like pre-World War II military pictures where men are so physically, like they'll lay their head in another dude's lap and they're all in a group and hanging out, and then gay panic happened. And then people were like, I don't want to be seen as gay, so I'm going to keep my distance and not touch other dudes because then I don't want to send a message or have that misconstrued, and I don't want to be perceived a certain way. And then you fast forward 40, 50 years, and now we're here where we're in a world where Queer Eye has happened now in its second iteration. But when I watched it, I went, what's really interesting about this is that men just need permission to be vulnerable. They need to understand that vulnerability is powerful, and not that it's, you know, not that emotion is weakness. And so part of that is just having those conversations and being around people who can model that and embody that, and I think that translates really well to the workplace. But it is super hard you need someone to have kind of subverted all of the messaging that we receive in that example to be able to demonstrate that, you know, in this example of masculinity, that masculinity can be variant and have a lot of different forms. Right. But it takes 5 gay guys taking over your house for some guys to learn that, you know what I mean? And it's so interesting to see that and to see that juxtaposed against, you know, people being told to man up and people being told to don't be a sissy or whatever the messages that I remember getting when I was You know, I was a kid that cried a lot. I went to my childhood school not that long ago, and I got stuck on those monkey bars once. And all the kids went running back into class, and I was like hanging and just being scared. And it was one of those things, I was like, I don't even remember how I got out of that. I remember the trauma. I remember that it was like super scary. And the worst thing was that I cried. Right. That was the worst thing about it. And you go, all right, so, you know, in those situations where we're invited to model good behavior, what does that mean, and how does that take a form in the rehearsal room or backstage or during a production or in the administrative offices? Like, what does that even look like when the microaggression version of that kind of stuff is happening?
Right, and even like speaking up, like for example, like if you've got a friend that's looking at porn or you know or things like that, and it's like, you know, and I've told somebody, tell them to knock it off, and they just have this fear, and it's like, you know, yeah, it's like how do you even do that? You know, it's scary. I mean, I can even say, because what's your next project? So I'm masculinating these guys. They just got fear in their eyes. It's like, no, we're not trashing you. But no, but it's like, but I say, no, because I know you know what I'm talking about. And they're like, like, you know. So it's like, it's tough. How do you get out of that? I mean, there's a couple men's organizations working on that, but it's not easy. You know, like Ian Black, he even said, okay, I'm going to say all this stuff, and I know I'm going to get trashed, and sure enough. But some guys are supporting him, too. So that's good.
Let's talk a little bit about, you've kind of alluded to it a little bit, about modeling and accountability and things like that. And let's talk a little bit about the bystander role in all of this, the person who witnesses something in rehearsal or backstage or anywhere along the line. Again, bystanders sometimes have the same risks. If they speak up, they might also get blackballed in some way. On the other hand, they're the witness. And so often in sexual harassment and sexual assault, there's not a witness. And so it's a powerful support to a victim survivor, too. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how bystander policies are brought into this conversation. I don't know if that's something that you're thinking about.
It's not something that we've named as specifically. So not speaking on company letterhead, but off the top of my own head, I feel like if somebody came to me or to our buds, yes, too many consonants, not enough vowels. Somebody came to our identified people with something they had witnessed, I would want to encourage them to take it up with the victim of what they'd witnessed, because sort of at the cornerstone of what we're working toward is an idea that came from Fair Play Minnesota about what is your desired outcome. If you come to me and tell me you had a problem with somebody, I don't get to decide what the solution to that is. I have to know what your desired outcome is. And if you come to me because you saw something, I have to ask you to go back to that person and either get their permission to speak on their behalf or encourage them to come forward. It's because their trauma is the thing that needs to be held at the center of it. And their desired outcome has to be the thing that is held at the center of it. I would also say that, like, this just crossed my mind, circling back to what I was talking about in terms of flexibility and evolution, that person's allowed to change their mind about the desired outcome. And giving someone enough safe space to make that decision, I think, is also really important. But in terms of bystander witness, I mean, it's another conversation that we're not necessarily teaching people how to have in the workplace, where someone can send to someone else after a meeting at which an inappropriate joke was made, an email that says, in the current context, I just want you to know that I was really offended by that, and if you wanted to make a complaint, I would stand by you. And the person who receives that email has the right to be like, whoa, I was the butt of that joke and I didn't even take it that way. How interesting, right? Yeah. But like even that then creates an opportunity for that person to think about, like, why wasn't I offended? Because perhaps it was not offensive to me, or perhaps because I have been cultured to just let it roll. Or perhaps some like totally messed up, incomprehensible combination of those two things. In fact, most likely something that but it's finding, to me, the heart of this policy is finding every opportunity we can to subvert that paradigm of everything's fine. This is just how it is. Like, I can remember being an undergrad coming into a costume shop in an opera where it doesn't even matter what the topic was, but the answer would always be, we've always done it that way.
Yeah.
And I would just sit there like 20 years old and be like, how can a company that makes art, like that's the thing we're doing, is creating art, even opera where you're like expected to meet certain standards and expectations and paradigms and whatever. Like the whole point is to make a new thing. How are the words, that's how it's always been, even leave your mouth once, much less like 7 times a day. And I mean, that was a particular staid culture. Lots of things have changed at that company, whatever. But to me, like that always becomes the heart of it. Is like, where can you crack open space for these conversations to happen? And so on the one hand, it feels unfair to me to say to that person, I can't do anything about it because you only told me you saw it. That's not the tone, right? That's not the way to frame that conversation. The way to frame that conversation is, I'm so grateful you're on the lookout for your colleagues, and I need that person to come and tell me what their desired outcome is.
It's a big part of that desired outcome, because we always want to remember victim agency. Mm-hmm. Or if somebody even sees themselves as a victim sometimes.
Right.
We don't want to put stuff on people if they don't believe that's where they're at.
What's happening.
I don't think people always know what that would look like either. You know, like they say, well, I need to be heard. Okay, well, what does being heard actually look like? Because
there's totally a series of follow-ups.
He can say a bunch of stuff and do a bunch of different actions, and that person may still feel like they're not being heard. So the question is, what does that look like to you?
Right.
So that we can help manifest that.
Right.
Because if I'm just going to keep throwing things at you, does this help? Do you feel heard now? I mean, it's like, that's not going to make it.
I'm going to keep talking to you till you feel heard.
Right.
Essentially.
And I'm going to hear you, and you're going to hear me.
I want to open this up for a moment and just see if anybody has any reactions or comments or questions. We'll keep going, but I just want to make sure if there's anything anybody wants to join in with. Yeah.
You had mentioned anonymity at one point. I'm just curious because I think this is a conversation that the Twin Cities have been grappling with, that when it comes to living in a rape culture and trying to apply solutions to it, which is really difficult. One of the solutions that we have come up with that is absolutely imperfect, but what we have right now is in terms of whisper networks. And a lot of that has been facilitated on social media. Not that that's a big part of whispering when it comes to these kinds of things. So I'm curious, in both a professional and official and non-official context, how you individually as artists confront stuff you get off of the Whisper Network in terms of artists you're working with or have auditioned for you or things like that.
When you say Whisper Network, could you also say rumor mill, or are you referring to something more specific? Like, that might just be a term I don't know.
Yeah. So Whisper Network to me is a community of people who are invested in keeping each other safe, have heard either directly from a victim or survivor or through whispering that this person is an unsafe person to work with, or this is a pattern of behavior that they've exhibited, and they want to let other people know because they don't feel comfortable coming forward. But if you're a director, you might not want to cast this person. Mm-hmm. That's what I would refer to as a whisper.
Thank you.
I think it's tricky territory. I mean, it's so nuanced, because I think part of the reason that the culture is the way it is because we aren't talking to each other. Mm-hmm. So talking to each other is important, that the conversation needs to be happening, and yet anybody can say anything about anybody. So I personally am a firm believer in I don't know, this is so complicated, dude. It's so all over the board. I mean, you know, as a survivor who came forward 30 plus years after the fact, people's tendency that knew me, believed me, because they know me. But I know there were a lot of people that didn't know me that didn't believe me. And then more people came forward. And now it's pretty much like, yeah, this happened. We all know that it happened. And with my perpetrator in particular, he's fled the country, and the courts basically said he's guilty. So it was me coming forward and speaking the truth in a void, and then more people coming forward that gave that weight. So there's strength in numbers, and you can also say anything about anybody. I have one of my children had somebody said something. He was working in a college theater. He was working building sets, and he had a young woman accuse him of something that he did not do. And it turns out that was a pattern for her. So as a mother, I feel like it's really important that due diligence has to be part of the equation. So if we're just going to say so-and-so's a creep, say it and hear it, but there's there needs to be more than a rumor in order for something to have weight. And yet, you have to believe this, believe the person that's, so it's like, it's so complicated because, if someone robs my house, I go to the police and I say, there's been a robbery at my house. And they immediately say, well, tell me what happened. We'll go investigate. Let's see what happened. See, did the door get broken in? And they go and check it out. And if I go to an authority and say I was raped, they'll go, well, really? Were you? Are you sure you didn't misconstrue? Or they maybe, it's like, so the tendency when it comes to anything that has to do with inappropriate sexual behavior, the tendency is to not believe the victim. So that's why it's so scary and complicated, and I think that's why people are trying to be so careful. So I say whisper network, yeah, and like there has to be more than just a rumor. It has to have some kind of context that people can put those pieces together and go, because if there's just one piece of a picture, we don't get to see the whole thing. But if there are several pieces, then I'm getting a clear picture. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think there can be a lot of validation in that. Like, am I sure I thought that about that one person? Oh, now I'm hearing 3 other people say it. Okay, now I'm starting to feel a little more confident that something happened to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's what's particularly motivating about a whisper network is that, like, you don't have to be the one and only person that comes forward and says something and hopes that people will back you up.
To me, also, when you say whisper network, to me that sounds like that we're not talking about some guy that's literally raping people in the elevator. We're talking about people who are being inappropriate and doing things that are making people uncomfortable and crossing boundaries, and that's something that we tend to, because of that boundary thing that we have spent our lives moving around, that we don't always know what that looks like. We know what it feels like, but we don't always necessarily know how to articulate it. So now we have all kinds of people articulating things that we can look back and go, oh, that happened to me 2 years ago, and I didn't even think, like you said, it's like we just don't even, it doesn't register, it doesn't come up on our radar because of that boundary moving. Mm-hmm. And so now I can say, yeah, no, I do know what you're talking about. I can give you some information that embellishes this clarity and understanding around how people are being. We have to stop being inappropriate with each other, and we have to stop accepting unacceptable behavior. And I think that's where the whisper network, whatever you want to call it, is beneficial, because we need to start seeing this person said this is unacceptable. And does that mean it's unacceptable to me as well? Yeah, I guess it does, because I shouldn't be letting that person be that way with me. So, I mean, just like I said, it's so complicated. It's no wonder we're all kind of stumbling around a little bit trying to figure out how to be with each other.
You know, years and years ago when I was actually directing 12 angry jurors for community theater, and my angry juror was making inappropriate comments to some of the women, and one of them reported it to me, and so it was interesting because I had a rehearsal with him and the head juror, so the two men in the room, and he happens to be used method acting, and he also, his story happens to be like almost exactly like his characters, his personal story, which that came out later. So he's a hurting guy too. But I sat down with him and I said, you know, so I know you use this method acting, so I was trying to save face for him instead of putting him on the defensive. And I had another guy in the room too, and not just everybody. And I said, you know, yeah, you know, so I know that you're like, you use this method acting and everything, but you probably want to be careful about how you use it, you know, with the other women in the cast. And he goes, yeah, you know, that's not the method acting. That's just me. I said, okay, then you need to control yourself. I was like, okay. And that was the end of it. I don't say that worked every time, but I got it. I sat late awake all night trying to figure out how this conversation was going to make it work, but it did. And then I went and told the producer about it just in case something else happened, so that they were prepared. So, but like you said, conversations are hard, but they have to happen. They just have to. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, I think I have a kind of a complicated relationship. I think of it more of the rumor mill kind of situation, because it actually happened in this room, where someone said to me, "Hey, I was really glad that I got a chance to know you through this like rehearsal process." And I was like, "Yeah, you too," just like thinking very innocently. And then this guy outlined the because you know, like I have some friends that like are like outside of your circle, or we run in different circles. And I was like, okay, and it just ended up being this very kind of weird conversation, and I was like, what is he? Finally kind of said, like, what are we talking about here? And so the kind of long and short of it is that I've been in emotionally and verbally abusive relationships, 2 of them. And that is something that I've like actually just in the last year been able to like say out loud to people. And the fact that I have said that to some people has been like very freeing for me, but at the same time, what I've realized is that these women have gone out and used whatever means that they've used to say stuff about me, and that there are people in our community as actors, and they're both actors, and who don't associate with me suddenly. Like, and I didn't know this. It was all kind of on the dark web of it all. And I was like, okay, well, this is a whole different thing to have been the victim of emotional abuse in a relationship, and then to feel as though because I'm the straight cis guy that's now used against me because of the assumptions that we make about people in relationships with one another. And so it's been really difficult to actually kind of process, like I have been in rooms with people who are adjacent to all of these people for the last 10 to 12 years. And now it's making sense. Like, oh, that's why they were so weird. That's why this is, you know, because they thought that I was doing things that were basically lies that were being told about me, and that I had hurt their friend. Which is so interesting when you look at the way, like, I had to outline it for some people using, you know, the whole Brock Turner situation and Kobe Bryant and, you know, and Ben Roethlisberger, and the way that people attack the person who's coming forward and just being true and just being honest about what happened. Because what ends up happening is in a lot of those high-profile cases, the people who came forward and reported end up going in hiding because there's so much scrutiny and there's so much victim blaming. And in my particular situation, in a male-female relationship and that dynamic, that it was something that created an impression that I was somehow doing some other things that I actually wasn't doing, because that was an easier thing to say than what the reality was, is that I was being cheated on by both in these two situations. And so all of that being like my experience with like the weirdness of somebody, of the rumor mill starting and people kind of having these conversations, I don't know how far they go. And that's actually really like, that said, I've also been a part of, because of the work that I've done, people coming to me and saying, hey, I really need to talk to somebody about this situation in the show that I'm doing, the situation that happened to me this one time after a show or whatever. And I try to work through the training that I've had, which is to say, as a bystander, to say, what do you want to have happen? Do you want me to, I have a good relationship with a lot of theaters, do you want me to go to those stage managers, artistic directors? I'm happy to sit down with them and have a conversation if you don't want to. And across the board, and it's really only happened 3 or 4 times, where I've been that person to sit with someone who has had something like that happen. And what makes it difficult is in each case they all said, no, it's fine. Like, I don't want you to, I just want to be heard. I just want, like, which I think is super important. But now I have, like, I know who those people are.
Right.
And that's not like a huge burden by any means, but it is something that, like, now I feel awkward about how this was handled, and now I don't, like, all of that, and I would never go and spread that around, and I know that about myself, but I also, we've talked about this, that I don't have confidentiality with, even though I have victim advocacy training and stuff like that, because I'm not working in that capacity. I don't have that. If I were compelled to in court or anything like that, I would have to say what I know, say what was told to me, and I try to make that very clear to the people that say, hey, I've heard that you've done this work before. Can I talk to you about it? So yeah, I mean, it is really complicated. It is a thing because I want people to make sure that they have support that's out there. I want people to know their resources. I want people to be able to, if someone were in a situation where, like, I've heard that this person is like a negative energy to be around, or someone who's like super weird and creepy or pansy or whatever, I would want to position myself in between that person and the creepy person. But it's also, it is that due diligence piece, which is really difficult to say, and it's really important to make people feel they're safe to talk to you at the same time. Those are seemingly opposing forces. And all of that said, like, all of like how does that work? Like the minutia of what that might be. I think people should just keep trying it. Yeah. I think we should just be doing more of it. We should be, if there were a stronger, more explicit bystander piece in a lot of these policies, I think that might actually be really helpful. Because the more that we can kind of shine light on it, the more I think, which is exactly what Me Too did, is to shine light on what's happening, and the strength of the numbers is really what brought us to where we are now. And so if there are more people who are willing to stand, next to, in front of, behind, with, however, with folks going through a tough time or having had a bad experience, I think that would really breed better behavior. I hope it does. That's what I'm crossing my fingers about, that this moment that we're in. I hope it creates better behavior.
Okay, you mentioned resources, and somebody have a question like that?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I had a question about what people think about how we post casting notices and production team notices. I know it's the tricky part, right? Where you're in this business where every 6 weeks you're with a different group of people, right? And if you were someone who had been victimized or who had negative interactions with someone in the community that made you uncomfortable, every 6 weeks you're in a potential situation to be in a room with those people. And I know as someone who has cast shows, I've often, or put production teams together, I'll often get a question, who's on the cast? And, I'll tell you who, if I'm halfway through casting the show, I can only tell you who I've cast so far. But, ideally, when you find out who's on the cast, it shouldn't be when you walk into the rehearsal room for the first day of rehearsal, so that because I'm always wondering, are you just curious, or is there just someone that you just hate working with? You designed a show with them before and it just didn't go well, or have you had an experience that you need to safeguard yourself against, right? And so, what are thoughts on the best way to sort of communicate that?
That's great.
Does that make sense?
Thoughts on the panel?
I would like to know that question as well. Good answer to that.
I think it's tricky.
I mean, I guess, do you ever, maybe you all can answer this, when you finally have your cast all put together and then do people get a chance to kind of see that cast list before they're all getting together, or no, you just show up the day of and that's when
I always send out an email after it's cast to everybody saying, welcome to the cast, and then they see everybody's name. So at that point in time, if they didn't like somebody, they could back out and I could still cast somebody else. But
I think that's a potential safeguard, is to not tell. You contact actors to ask if they are still available or what have you, but make an announcement.
Yep.
Instead of sort of rolling announcements where now someone's accepted it and then someone else gets added to the team that causes tension.
when they walk into the first read-through, they all know who's in the cast anyway.
Yep. And it's tricky because we also have actors drop out occasionally. And
sure. We don't have the option to always have a complete list every time that then stays a complete list. Right. But
my brain keeps going back to the term whisper network, and can't we have an out loud network?
We don't live in a culture.
No, I know, but can we move to that? Because that's really let's say it out loud, because that's the whole break the silence movement. Is we are not going to be silent anymore. And and part of it is because you have people like Brock Turner getting away with murder practically, and then the victims of crimes being basically re-victimized by speaking out. And I feel like the voice has gotten big now, and it just needs to stay big and loud. If we can keep it big and loud, we won't need whisper networks, because we won't have to be, we can just go, that guy's a creep, and just say it. Let's say it out loud. That guy is not easy to work with. That guy he's a creeper. And then we know, instead of it being this undercurrent, let's say what's true. That's what I want. I hope we can move to that, because so many things will be solved.
I don't want to jump on what you're saying, but I just want to say, I think we should treat things more like a safety concern. If people are unsafe because of people who are predators, we need to treat that like a safety concern. We need to treat that like you would. You wouldn't let me walk into this room if there was water and an electrical thing on the floor.
Right. Of course.
Go home.
Yeah.
But what constitutes a predator?
And
a predator for one person is one. So it's where.
But if you
so complicated.
If you started, if you report. I was a lifeguard.
I'm not arguing with you, by the way. I absolutely agree with you.
I'm just thinking, because I was a lifeguard for a few years, and you had to report every Band-Aid you handed out to every child, whether or every incident that happened, you had to report I handed out a Band-Aid so that they knew if the kid got scratched on the slide, and it's one kid, you're like, okay, that kid got scratched on the slide, oops. If it's 5 kids that got scratched on the slide, you have a slide problem, Like, that's why we need to get in the habit of, like, reporting and making the report, like, a standard report that makes those reports,
And I would add in the right space too, because I always worry about things underground, kind of talking to each other, because what somebody else could have a very good experience with that person, maybe it was just flirting gone really bad. We don't know what the issue was. I'm not belittling anything, but it's like I worry about that too, that somebody getting trashed who shouldn't have been, or I don't know, or rumors gone awry. Anything could happen.
I think the tricky thing, and I've thought about this a lot, it's the first time I approached you about this, was to say, like, is there a way for freelancers in our industry to have a central reporting place? Yeah. And we don't know the answer to that question, because the reality is you could work at a theater, you could do some bad stuff, that could all get swept under the rug, and you could just get hired another 6 weeks, 12 weeks later at another theater, and no one would know anything. And one of the frustrating examples that I have of that is a friend of mine who did report something about being harassed by a castmate, and reported it up the chain to the stage manager, managing director of the theater, and then to find out that person who was harassing her was then hired for the next show after she had reported and given his name and everything. And I was like, really? So this is super problematic, isn't it? Like, and now, and that's another one of those situations. I don't want to be in a room with that guy. I don't know even really, but I'm closer to this friend and I trust her word, and I go, I don't want to work with him. And I don't know how to, that's the weird thing about how do I weigh that out in my life, because there are people that I'm like, I don't want to be in a room with them for 6 weeks or on stage with them. How do I weigh that out? How do I look at a cast list and say, well, for the amount of money that they're going to pay me times the amount of time that I'm going to be there multiplied, but what is that? It seems like a weird formula to be able to say, like, how much am I willing to sacrifice of my own sanity or my own well-being or my heart because it's a good paycheck, or because it's a show that I've always wanted to do, or all of that stuff. It makes it super complicated.
So you're in the same position as those young women under Harvey Weinstein, basically, in a different degree.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the person's in power.
Yeah.
Yeah, that follow-up question.
I think this is dangerously close to me saying that's how it's always been. I don't think it should be, but I think we all make that calculus all the time, whether it's about an unsavory personality or, like, as a freelancer, it's like good, fast, cheap, pick two. Every contract. There is no perfect contract. I mean, I can imagine a couple because I haven't worked everywhere, but, like, I'm always doing some form of, so that's going to work out to like 65 cents an hour. But I'm going to get to make this really cool thing that this person might see. And I'm not trying to do 4 other things at the same time, so I can actually give it the amount of time it deserves to be proud of the work. Okay, yes, I can take that for 65 cents an hour. And I'm actually only being slightly hyperbolic. This is a thing we say to each other, particularly as costume designers, because that's the context I have for it. But I think all designers probably do this. We have this conversation all the time where we're like, ever so often, you got to really track your hours and do the math, because you can't negotiate from a point of ignorance. You can't say, you can know, like, in the pit of your soul that you are worth more, but you can't negotiate from that if you don't have the math. And I did it on a project in December, and it wasn't 65 cents an hour, but it wasn't minimum wage. It wasn't even federal minimum wage, never mind Minnesota minimum wage. And although I will also say, like, as a complete aside, not related to this, what was kind of cool about that was I had the opportunity to then look at that list and be like, 10 years ago, this would have taken me a lot longer. That's really cool. Like, I've been doing this long enough that I make decisions differently and more efficiently, and, like, that was, so it had had a positive benefit as well. So yes, like I said, it's dangerously close to saying that's how it's always been, but I do feel like to an extent, we make that calculus all the time. I think that the purpose of these conversations is to make sure that your physical and emotional safety isn't one of the calculus points that you're putting on that, right? Like, it is just about money and just about recognition. These are like not small things in any of our freelancers' lives. But yeah. And then I have a question that for the room. In the same way that you have these things in tension of due diligence and wanting to always center the victim's story and wanting to always make sure that that person's needs are being met, what are the brass tacks people see as ways to be able to honor transparency and anonymity? Because that's a thing for me, right? Like,
Yeah.
there are people in our company who have the technological skill to create an anonymous reporting system. The fact will still remain that someone and I don't know how to do that. So as somebody with my limited technology understanding, like, what would you tell me to make me believe that that person who created the system couldn't figure out who it really was?
Sure.
I also know that the people in our company wouldn't do that, but you don't have to know that as an actor who's never worked with us before. Like, you just take our word for it. So I have like some real brass tacks questions about this. We're really into the idea of transparency, and we're really excited about the possibility of keeping documentation to help identify patterns of people's behavior. But then we're going to keep that anonymous. But then who has access to that, and who? Like, I just
It's a conundrum.
Yes.
There's no easy answers to any of these questions.
Yeah.
No, but I feel like somehow we have the technology to figure that out. I don't personally. I
promise you I don't.
I believe you. But I wonder, like, and beyond the actual technology behind it, just sort of philosophically, like, what are people's thoughts about balancing transparency and anonymity and how that functions in a community as small as ours?
And I think there's some challenges with that. I mean, I think sometimes if you have the means, sometimes you can have an outside source, that's taking it so it's completely dispassionate and can report information back. That's one way of going about it.
Fair Play Minnesota has an anonymous reporting system, and I have considered reaching out to them to ask how big a clearinghouse they're willing to be. I mean, they came into being very specifically for the improv community, and they're doing extremely important work in that realm. That doesn't mean that they have a person on staff who's like ready to handle what could be. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, the answer to that question is ask them, and they will tell you if we have space for that or we don't. But yeah.
I mean, that is fundamentally one of the problems with electronic anonymous reporting systems. I mean, this is what the internet's taught us, right?
Right.
There's always some guy out there who's going to figure out how to troll the system.
Yeah.
And create chaos. And, I think luckily we're a small enough community that can be insulated, but the larger you grow that community, the more chance you get that someone's going to use that purely for the sake of chaos.
Right. Right.
Mm. And why can't people just act good?
But of course, the lawyer in me is going, okay, let's see, the various liability issues that come up. But but the lawyer in me also wants to remind people that there are options, even for freelancers. There is still the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, for example, as a place to send complaints, and they will investigate them and determine whether or not there's something there. You may not always have, the standard employment law claim that you have if you're an employee, but there are other human rights claims that you can make too. So, and then the other side of my lawyer hat goes, the difficulty with publicly speaking about things is defamation.
Of course.
Yeah. And so then you are balancing that as well. And certainly I've seen victims who have defamation claims brought against them, and things happen, and this is just a way to silence them.
Yeah.
But that's always the risk that comes to it too. So not only are you kind of balancing all the ethical and just sort of general day-to-day stuff, you have to balance the legal stuff with that too.
Yeah.
On that happy note, I'll turn to a couple more questions. The lawyers always bring things down in the room.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Yeah. So I know we're getting probably close to the end, so I want to make sure we get a couple of questions out here. First of all, Pogi, a little bit earlier, you mentioned something about resources. What do you guys think are some good resources that people can use to create policies? You've mentioned some already, but tools, things that people should be looking for. We want to get beyond, of course, the checklist. Mm-hmm. What actually sticks with people?
I think offering a anonymous call line, like the rain hotline or something, as a resource in all of that stuff, I think is super important because it adds a layer when you are thinking about, is this going to affect my job? Is this going to affect how this artistic director, managing director, other person in leadership of this company is going to look at me if I speak to them about it? So having some sort of third-party resource where people can go, something that happened, that they can talk to an advocate.
And I guess to that point, I've got little pamphlets right here, rapehelpmen.org. If you're ever wanting to find a crisis line, there's a website where you can go on there, plug in your zip code, and find out the closest one. And 24/7, free, confidential, many, many different parts of the state have that. Other resources or tools that are useful?
So we found, as I said, Fair Play Minnesota to be a really helpful model. And the Minnesota Theater Alliance's parts documentation on their website. I think the most directly helpful has been the Chicago movement, Not in Our House. I also think, and again, I keep bringing it back to this idea of we're building a new community every 6 or 12 weeks. One of the things that we want to, so we've arrived at a place where we're pursuing 3 paths. And one is a foundational document for the rehearsal process that starts the first rehearsal with, this is what we're doing, this is the story we're telling, this is why we're telling it. What do you need? What is this population of 7 or 10 people versus the last time we did it with most of the same people, but not all? At this moment, because you get to change your mind, what does this population need in order to feel like they're creating this work in a safe space? And that comes from the process at Green Tea, where they have a literally completely other culture because they have artistic directors who don't come from a Western school of thought. And they start, they take it a lot farther. They start every rehearsal with a check-in that way of like, where are you today on this subject? And and we've thought about some ways to like really make that present throughout. Like, is that putting those terms on giant Post-its and keeping them in the rehearsal hall the whole time? Is it drafting something that gets sent out as an email that people can refer back to? But like just really letting the room itself be a resource in its own, in that way, being an immediate space thing. So the first idea is this foundational document that we're drafting. The second is very specifically, what is the path? How do you follow the path? What happens when you go down the path? And then the third piece is what I was talking about before, finding a way to be able to respect everyone's anonymity and still review it as a company and say, how do we feel about how this was handled? How do we feel about what we can do to make sure it doesn't come up again, or when it comes up again, how to handle it differently, and that kind of a review process. So I feel like those are kind of their own resources in a way. Like, it's not a resource where you go somewhere and download a template, but it's trying to figure out how to also, I feel like that also raises the accountability piece. Like, you were a part of a contract that said that this was what you needed, and you heard this person say that what they needed was this, and you agreed to like play in this sandbox this time this way.
Yeah, and if we're establishing those rules out loud, then those people who might be in the Whisper network will be hearing it and be
knowing,
aware
and hopefully
that
taking
the times they are a-changing. And
hopefully taking from that this is a safe space.
Right.
Where if they need to whisper to someone or that they don't need to whisper, those are options.
There's a couple of... Were you done?
Yes.
Okay. I think MNCASA is a great resource. personally. I think you guys have a great website. But there's two things that pop up to me about just sort of like the everyday Googling certain things. David Schwimmer has the 6 videos that he directed and produced, are extremely powerful. And there's one in particular about the costume designer. I don't know if you've seen those videos, but there's a costume designer with an actor that is just so uncomfortable because you're like, yep, I know that's happened. I know people that's happened to. But they are just sort of in a layman's term, like let's even just look like what does harassment look like? And these videos are beautifully done, and they are just, at the end of it just says that's harassment. So it gives people some context, which I think is really good. And then another one, just a couple of words to Google, trauma brain. There's tons of videos out there about what is going on with people on the inside around trauma. There are so many people, and you can rattle off the statistics around what it looks like as far as sexual assaults in the culture, but we're walking into rehearsal rooms with people who have been victimized, men and women, and that if we understand, if we inform ourselves, if we become trauma informed, we're better advocates for those people, and we can create safer spaces for them. So trauma brain is something that until very recently I didn't really even know what that term was, and I think it's extremely useful. So
that's a great piece. Yeah, the neurobiology of trauma. Rebecca Campbell is a well-known expert nationally. If you ever look up her name, she's got some little videos that you can see on that. And David Lisak, who works quite a bit with male survivors, has some really amazing stuff on that too. And I think it's really accessible too. You don't have to be a neuroscientist to understand what's going on with it. But once you listen to it, you're like, we've all been there in some time, once or twice or 100 times in our lives. So we recognize when we see that, oh yeah, I did freeze in that instance. Or yeah, my voice did close up and I couldn't speak at that point. And this is stuff you can't control. Mm-hmm. And so it really, I think, kind of helpful to know that, very much so. A good example. Okay. And certainly, MNCASA, we have, I have a handout here that gets you to our website. If you want to find materials there, you're always welcome to ask us for that too. So I want to close up with a question here we're in this really interesting time and place around this issue with this movement. And how do you think this is going to manifest in new works? Mm-hmm. Or in the ways that, maybe older productions are reinvented now in this new environment? Are you already seeing those kinds of changes, or do you anticipate seeing those changes?
Carmen? The Florence Carmen?
Yeah.
They rewrote the ending of the Florence Carmen, where instead of him killing her, she grabs his knife and kills him.
Yeah.
And they did it in Italy because in the Italian language, there's a word for, we have words for it, right? Domestic violence, domestic homicide. But they have a word for it. It's so prevalent for a woman to die at the hands of her intimate partner in Italy that there's like a term in the language for it. But that's a high-profile case. There's lots of other ways that this will happen in your work, certainly.
Yeah, Shelli, what about your work? Yeah.
Well, we're diving into masculinity, so it's right there.
Is this a big part of the conversation? What's going on right now as you're diving in?
It is. Actually, I've had this project in my mind for several years, and I had no clue that all this stuff was going to pop up right now. It's like karma. I don't know, but it's time. So. And the more you dig, the more complicated it gets. It's like, oh boy. To the point where, the title of the company is named Project for a reason. We don't put them out every 6-10 weeks. They might be once a year at least, but sometimes more. But everything really is a project. And for this one, normally we have all the stuff that leads up to the major production, perform 8-9 different places, and but this time I go, it's not enough. We got to do more than this. So that's why I'm engaging the community with readings. We're getting gathering writings from people, trying to get different artists to, I've already found artists that have already created work, and they've all been guys, spoken word or whatever, getting them to submit work. We're targeting different populations as well as the general public, because I really want to engage people, and I'm planning to go in and go do readings. I just think we really need to have a bigger conversation than just let's do performance and then we're done. And the thing is, we always have so many requests for more performances after we're done, because unfortunately when we're done the issue doesn't go away. I wish it did. So we're trying to build an infrastructure where we actually have ways to get it out there and funding behind it, because typically what happens is people have no clue what it takes to put on theater. And that actors get paid as minimal as everybody gets paid in the theater, they get paid. And that they all move on, right away. So they don't know that. And so everybody was, oh, can you bring it here? And da-da-da. And, they have no idea what it takes to put on a show or what it costs, and nobody has any funding to, in their words. So, but we're looking at trying to figure out how to do that as well. I'm talking about all my dreams, and then to start taking things to outstate Minnesota too, especially in the last production. We had so many requests from outstate Minnesota, even from across the country.
Yeah.
So that's what's on my docket.
When is the show going to be out?
I think it'll be in the fall, probably. Okay. Yeah.
Great.
I don't even have the date set yet.
Keep an eye open for it.
I think it's important to keep telling the stories that are hard to hear, and there's going to come a point where the public is going to feel very saturated by those stories, and they're going to get a little deaf to it. And I think on the flip side of that, what we really need to be doing is showing more stories that show women in powerful positions. And the big piece to me right now is Black Panther. That's that movie is so kick-ass, and there is chock full of strong women, particularly women of color. It's that community, just needs to be lifted up even more than the women in white community. But that's the piece that we can keep pounding, and nobody's going to get tired of that. Well, I hope they don't. But they won't get tired of that in the same way. They will. It's so much easier for people to look at uplifting stories and share those, and it's the stories that bring us down and make us look at the deep dark stuff in us. They're hard. For instance, Indecent on the Guthrie stage. It is the most profound piece of theater that I think I have ever seen. I sobbed at the end of it, and I feel like that's what theater should be, and I can't go see Indecent every day. I mean, if I do, I will become numb to it, number one. But it's stories that lift women up, I think, is just as powerful as telling the stories of our distresses.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of subversive ways that aren't necessarily the big ways in which we can change. I mean, we're keepers of the culture, and part of this is it's a cultural issue. And I grew up thinking that the way that a heterosexual man kissed a heterosexual woman involved this stare thing where they both sort of telepathically knew what they wanted, And why did I know that? Because Hollywood told me that.
Yeah. Right.
And it wasn't until I went to college, and I'm old enough that when I went away to college, Antioch had just invented the first ever affirmative consent policy ever, right? And there were two kids from Antioch who came to my college and explained it, and everyone thought they were crazy.
Yeah.
Women and men alike, And so I think the culture can help to advance the narrative in small ways by, putting women in strong positions, having women who are there not just as romantic interests in the narrative, but who do powerful things, and showing people in healthy relationships,
I think also reconsidering the canon. Not only producing new work that elevates stories we're not hearing, but why do we keep telling the same? I mean, opera is full of that, right? Why do we keep coming back to these stories where there's no agency for the women in the story, there's violence against them, and there are ways in which you can tell those stories that are relevant and purposeful and intentional. I'm not sure that every time we tell ourselves that's what we're doing, that's what we're actually accomplishing. In fact, I'm quite certain it's not.
Well, I find it interesting, some of the stuff that's come out of talkbacks too. Like our very first production, one of the lines in there is that every woman lives with the fear of being raped. And I had 7 women in the cast, and we all agreed there were no men in the cast. And in every talkback, all the women in the audience would go, every woman. And at one performance, the talkback, this man stood up and he said, on behalf of all the men in the room, I apologize to all the women in the room. And there was conversations too, like I had this with my last cast, and also after some of the productions, as women, even tonight, okay, I got to go to the parking ramp by myself in the dark. How am I going to do that? If I park as close as I can to the elevator? Do I get in that elevator with that man I don't know when the door closes? Can I even go there because it's dark out? It's like all these things you have to think about to keep yourself from getting raped. And the men are going, really? Wow, I had no clue, but how would you if you don't live it? And one of the men that was at one of our performances of Body and Soul about sex trafficking, afterwards he goes, the thing is that from the time we're little, guys were just taught to get laid as much as possible. Just go out there and get laid. So what else? What do you know if that's what your message is all the time? And then the way women and girls are portrayed, and and even belittled. Don't throw like a girl, and on and on and on. In poses, in ads, and that are quite provocative. We address that in one of my shows as well. You can go on and on. This is what you see. This is what you know. And then if you weren't brought up in a way where you're having good role models to show you something different, how to treat people with respect, it goes awry.
Pogi, did you have anything to add about where you're seeing work going?
I think there's a lot of kick-ass female playwrights right now that, quite honestly, should be produced more. And I think the Broadway example of Paul Vogel is a great. Just looking at the statistics of all of Indecent being on Broadway, and that she's got the Pulitzer and all of all of that, and this is just what it takes. Just acknowledging what it takes for a woman to be successful is okay. So let's start there. Let's start with the acknowledgement and the understanding that these accolades have to be so much higher for women in the playwriting world to just be produced, and to be produced in a high level, like the Guthrie or on Broadway or and in those kinds of spaces. And I think that there's a lot of stuff that deserves to be not just produced, but also read. Just like that, we should be reading these pieces. We should be looking at a more comprehensive sense of what stories aren't being told, and let's find those pieces, because a lot of them are really well written, and let's read them together, and let's make that part of the education, and make that part of the kind of common knowledge in the industry of what kinds of stories are out there, because it's that same thing. If you never see it produced, if you never hear about it, then you're just there's no other really logical place to go than that doesn't exist.
Right.
And so the more that we can subvert kind of what is out there and what's been out there for centuries, I think that that's a good place to go, and to elevate those stories that from communities that are typically underrepresented and in roles in which they're not typically able to be seen in the media, in society. Why not put those kinds of stories on the stage where they get to see themselves roles?
Absolutely.
Which is great.
That's great. Thank you. Any final comments or questions before we wrap up? Folks on the panel, do you have any last words you'd like to share with everybody?
keep talking, keep
Yeah,
saying
say
stuff
keep
out loud.
talking,
I mean, this
keep
conversation
conversing.
just can't stop here. It has to be. I mean, one of the things that I really liked about this conversation tonight was there was a lot of conversation about the solution to the problem. We can talk about the problem. We need to identify it because we need to all know what we're talking about, and we need to find the solution to the problem and keep working towards that.
I have one thing I want to add. I think, if I'm not skipping maybe, I think one of the things that maybe to be talked about, especially with young boys growing up, I think something that parents can reinforce is letting their boys know that it's okay to talk to their friends, you know, their male friends. Talk about your emotions, how you doing. Don't just get together and talk about sports or, you know, just the generic stuff. Like, really have conversation, and I think that's something that's missing. I think with boys and men in general, is that when we get together, our conversations are very generic. It's about, you know, the game yesterday or this movie. It's never about how you feeling, like, you know, how you really feel, you know, what's going on in your life, you know, what are your goals, like, just really talk.
Right.
And I think if we can start that with boys at a young age, and then teach them, and, you know, that carries them throughout life, and that they know to have expectations and how to really have certain conversations, not just, you know, as they grow up with their partners, but if you can teach them at a young age, I think it helps them, you know, as they grow up to be men. And that's, you know, again, it's the same thing of keeping up the conversation and just keep talking. So that's just
That's
all
great.
I'm saying.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Keep spreading that word.
Yeah, thank you.
Justin Baldoni is one person that I don't know if you've heard of him. He just recently started producing a show called Man Enough, and it's like starts with a round table of all of these different artists of different stripes, and he talks directly about that. Do you ever get together with your guy friends and talk about your feelings? Like, literally, just like that's the basic as it gets. And why don't we? And then it just extrapolates all of the stuff of masculinity. And it's an effort to kind of break those systemic things apart, but we need to be talking about them because we can solve a lot of problems if we can get at some of those roots.
Yeah.
I think.
I said to one of my friends the other day, I said, you know, if everybody just really had somebody to talk to all the time, we wouldn't need any therapists. She goes, yeah, but the therapists don't want the word to get out.
You can take 2 steps back from that. We just went to therapy. We'd be in an entirely different situation. We don't need to put the therapist out of business. We need to amplify the goodness of that.
That is so therapeutic. It is. If you keep it all in, that's when it explodes in not good ways.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much to everybody on the panel. Really appreciate it.